Jesus was hungry. He saw a fig tree covered with leaves, approached it, and found no fruit. Then he said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." Mark immediately adds the detail that makes the scene difficult. It was not the season for figs. Why condemn a tree for failing to produce what the season did not require? Many explanations focus on botany. Some argue that leaves could signal edible early growth. Others suggest Jesus expected leftover fruit or an unusually early crop. The evidence is debated, and Mark's sentence remains deliberately uncomfortable. The overlooked detail is what happens between the curse and the withering. Jesus enters Jerusalem. He enters the temple. He overturns the tables of money changers, stops traffic through the courts, and accuses the temple establishment of turning a house of prayer for all nations into a den of robbers. Only the next morning does Mark return to the tree. It has withered from the roots. The fig tree is not an isolated outburst. Mark has wrapped it around the temple action. Tree, temple, tree. The fruitless branches explain the crowded courts, and the judge temple explains the curse. The question is not why Jesus expected an ordinary breakfast out of season. The question is why Israel's temple faced a visitation for which its leaders were not prepared. The scene belongs to Jesus' final approach to Jerusalem. Mark Sutton 11 begins near Bethphage and Bethany, villages on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives. Jesus sends 2 disciples to obtain a colt. He enters the city while people spread garments and branches on the road and shout words from Psalm 118. Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. The acclamation sounds royal. Zechariah had pictured Zion's king coming humble and riding on a donkey. Pilgrims arriving for Passover would have filled the roads, and Roman authority would have watched festival crowds carefully because Israel's memory of liberation could intensify hopes of deliverance. But Mark ends the entry in an unexpected way. Jesus goes into the temple, looks around at everything, and leaves for Bethany because it is late. No immediate confrontation, no speech, only inspection. The next day, the same pattern happens again. Jesus sees a fig tree from a distance. He approaches and inspects it. Leaves promise something, but he finds nothing except leaves. Then he proceeds to the temple and inspects its activity through prophetic action. Mark has made the tree and the temple mirror one another before either judgment is explained. The temple was not a minor building within Jerusalem. It was the center of sacrifice, pilgrimage, priestly service, sacred calendar, and national memory. Herod the Great had begun a massive expansion that continued for decades. Enormous retaining walls supported a platform visible across the city. Courts organized access. Priests offered sacrifices. Levites served. Pilgrims exchanged currencies and obtained animals suitable for offerings. Money changing and animal sales were not automatically corrupt. Temple dues required acceptable coinage, and travelers could not easily bring unblemished animals across long distances. The services had a legitimate function within the sacrificial economy. Mark's accusation, therefore, cannot be reduced to commerce merely existing near worship. Jesus targets what the institution has become and what its leadership is doing within God's house. His first quotation comes from Isaiah 56. "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." In Isaiah, foreigners who join themselves to the Lord are welcomed to the holy mountain. Their sacrifices are accepted, and the temple becomes a place of prayer extending beyond Israel. His second quotation comes from Jeremiah 7, "A den of robbers." Jeremiah's phrase does not primarily describe thieves stealing inside a cave. A den is the refuge to which robbers return after violence. The prophet condemned people who oppressed, shed innocent blood, practiced idolatry, and then entered the temple saying they were safe. The temple had become a shelter for covenant unfaithfulness. By joining Isaiah and Jeremiah, Jesus does more than protest high prices. He announces that the institution meant to welcome the nations and embody covenant holiness has become implicated in exclusion, injustice, and false security. That is the world into which the fig tree extends its leaves. Mark's literary technique is often called intercalation. He begins one story, interrupts it with another, and then returns to finish the first. The two stories interpret one another. In Mark 3, Jesus' family comes to restrain him. The scribes accuse him of acting by demonic power, and the family scene resumes. Questions about household and authority surround the dispute over the source of Jesus' power. In Mark 5, Jairus asks Jesus to save his daughter. On the way, a woman suffering from bleeding touches Jesus and is healed. Then, messengers announce that Jairus' daughter has died. The woman's 12 years of suffering and the girl's 12 years of life are placed together, while fear, faith, impurity, and restoration move through both stories. In Mark 6, the disciples are sent on mission. Their return is delayed while Mark narrates the death of John the Baptist under Herod. The successful mission of Jesus' messengers is framed by the cost paid by another messenger. Mark 11 uses the technique with unusual severity. The first half of the fig tree story ends with a curse. The temple action fills the middle. The second half reveals a tree withered from the roots. The arrangement is not accidental. If the temple episode were removed, the tree would look like a puzzling miracle of destruction. If the fig tree were removed, the temple action might be reduced to a temporary protest against merchants. Placed together, they become a prophetic sign of judgment. Mark even prepares the connection through verbs of seeing and finding. Jesus enters Jerusalem and goes into the temple. He looks around at everything. The next morning, he sees a fig tree in leaf from a distance and goes to discover whether he will find anything on it. He finds nothing but leaves. Then he enters the temple and begins driving out those buying and selling. Inspection comes before judgment. The tree is not condemned because it is visually ugly. It is covered with leaves. The temple is not judged because it is inactive. It is crowded with worshippers, animals, coins, tables, priests, and pilgrims. Both display abundance. The question is fruit. This brings us back to the phrase, "For it was not the season for figs." The Greek word translated season is kairos. It can describe an appointed or fitting time, not merely chronological time in the abstract. Mark uses it elsewhere for a decisive moment. Jesus enters Galilee announcing, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near." In the parable of the tenants, the owner sends a servant at the season to receive fruit from the vineyard. It would be too much to claim that every use of kairos carries the same symbolic meaning. Context remains decisive. In Mark 11, the immediate sense concerns the season for figs, but the word resonates with the chapter's larger question. What time is it for the temple? The Passover crowds see a royal entry. Jesus sees a house approaching judgment. The leaders continue the ordinary operation of sacrifice and commerce. Jesus announces a prophetic crisis. The phrase about fig season may therefore prevent a simple horticultural explanation. If Mark wanted the reader to think the tree was naturally defective, he did not need to state that figs were out of season. The added sentence makes the action more symbolic, not less. Scholars have proposed botanical solutions. Fig trees in the region could produce more than one crop. Small early figs might appear before or with leaves, while the main crop ripened later. Some argue that a tree already in full leaf near Passover might reasonably be inspected for edible early growth. Others answer that Mark explicitly says it was not fig season and that later descriptions of varieties and agricultural cycles do not settle the ancient narrative. The text does not identify the species, microclimate, stage of growth, or exact calendar date. No botanical reconstruction commands universal agreement. Mark's literary structure is much clearer. The tree has leaves. The temple has activity. Neither yields what Jesus seeks at the moment of visitation. The fig tree was already an ancient biblical image. In Deuteronomy, figs belong to the abundance of the promised land. The land contains wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. The fig is a sign of settled provision. During Solomon's reign, Judah and Israel are described as dwelling securely, each person under vine and fig tree. The phrase becomes an image of peace, land, and covenant blessing. Micah and Zechariah reuse that picture when imagining restoration. People sit beneath vine and fig tree without fear. The image does not merely describe agriculture. It describes ordered life under divine peace. The prophets can reverse the symbol. Hosea recalls finding Israel like grapes in the wilderness and seeing the ancestors like early fruit on a fig tree, only to narrate their movement into idolatry. Jeremiah speaks for the Lord. When he would gather the people, there are no grapes on the vine and no figs on the fig tree. Even the leaves wither. The absence of fruit accompanies judgment upon covenant unfaithfulness. Micah laments, "There is no cluster to eat, no early fig that I desire." The prophet immediately explains the image. The faithful have disappeared from the land. Violence and corruption dominate. Rulers and judges demand payment. And even close relationships have become dangerous. In those passages, fruitlessness is moral and covenantal. God comes seeking what should characterize his people and finds violence, idolatry, or injustice. Mark does not quote those texts explicitly beside the tree, yet the prophetic world makes the action intelligible. Jesus behaves like a prophet whose symbolic deed announces what words alone will soon make explicit. Jeremiah wore a yoke to embody submission to Babylon. Ezekiel constructed a model of besieged Jerusalem, lay on his side, rationed food, and packed baggage as an exile. Hosea's household became a sign of covenant betrayal and promised restoration. Prophetic actions could be strange because they made judgment visible. Jesus' word against the fig tree belongs to that tradition. The tree becomes an enacted parable. Its destruction is not the uncontrolled anger of a hungry traveler. It is a sign placed on the road to the temple. The temple action itself also follows prophetic patterns. Jesus does not simply inspect merchandise. He drives out sellers and buyers, overturns the tables of money changers and seats of dove sellers, and refuses to allow anyone to carry a vessel through the temple. The action interrupts operations. How extensive or long the interruption was cannot be known. The temple platform was enormous, and Mark does not say Jesus permanently halted the entire sacrificial system that day. The chief priests and scribes remain able to plan against him, and temple activity continues in the narrative world. The act is symbolic and confrontational. Jesus then teaches. The Isaiah quotation names the intended reach of the temple, prayer for all nations. The Jeremiah quotation names the corruption, a den of robbers. Isaiah 56 belongs to a section announcing restoration after exile. Foreigners who fear exclusion are told not to say the Lord will separate them from his people. Those who hold fast to the covenant are brought to the holy mountain. Their offerings are accepted. The temple's purpose includes a horizon wider than ethnic Israel alone. Jeremiah 7 belongs to a temple sermon delivered before Babylon destroyed the first temple. Worshippers repeat, "The temple of the Lord," as though possession of the sanctuary guarantees protection. Jeremiah answers that theft, murder, adultery, false oath, idolatry, and oppression cannot be hidden beneath temple confidence. He points to Shiloh, an earlier sanctuary that did not escape judgment. By quoting Jeremiah inside the second temple, Jesus reopens the prophet's warning. A sacred building is not immune because it is sacred. Priestly activity is not fruit simply because it is religious activity. The presence of leaves does not answer the search for figs. The chief priests and scribes understand the danger. Mark says they begin seeking a way to destroy Jesus because they fear him, and the crowd is astonished at his teaching. Their response confirms that the action challenges authority, not merely commercial technique. When evening comes, Jesus and the disciples leave the city. The next morning, Peter sees the tree. It is withered from the roots. That detail matters. The judgment is not a few damaged leaves. The source of future fruitfulness has been struck. What looked vigorous from a distance has no remaining life beneath the surface. Peter calls Jesus Rabbi and points to the result. The tree he cursed has withered. Jesus answers, "Have faith in God." Then the passage turns toward a mountain thrown into the sea: prayer, belief, and forgiveness. This transition can appear to leave the temple interpretation behind. Some readings treat the withered tree primarily as an example of miracle-working faith. Jesus spoke, the tree died, and disciples can likewise accomplish impossible acts through believing prayer. The words certainly teach confidence in God, but the context should not be discarded. Jesus is standing near Jerusalem after confronting the temple. The phrase, "this mountain," may point generally to an impossible obstacle, drawing upon Jewish imagery in which mountains represent immense difficulty. It may also carry a more immediate resonance with the Temple Mount before them. Scholars disagree over how specifically the saying should be connected to the temple. The command is not a technique by which desire controls creation. The object is God. Have faith in God. Prayer belongs to trust in the divine purpose Jesus has just enacted. It also belongs to a community no longer able to locate access to God solely in the judge temple order. Mark adds forgiveness to the prayer saying, when the disciples stand praying, they are to forgive whatever they hold against another, so that their Father may forgive them. Some manuscripts add another verse about refusal to forgive. Its absence from important early witnesses leads many critical editions to omit or bracket it. The securely attested saying is already enough to prevent triumphalism. The disciples are not being trained to curse trees at will. They are being formed as a praying, forgiving community under God, while the temple conflict moves toward its climax. Now the central revelation can be stated. Jesus did not curse the fig tree because he misunderstood the calendar. Mark tells the story so the reader will understand the temple: leaves, no fruit, inspection, judgment, withering from the roots. The troubling sentence, "It was not the season for figs," is part of the warning. The temple leaders could claim that the expected fruit was premature, that the institution was operating normally, that sacrifices were being offered, and that Passover had arrived as it always did. But the kingdom announced in Mark 1 had brought its own appointed time. The Messiah had come to his city. The Lord had visited his house. The search for fruit could not be postponed. That does not mean Mark condemns Jewish people as an ethnic whole. Jesus, his disciples, the crowds, the women who follow him, and the earliest believers in Mark's world are Jewish. The temple itself stands within Israel's covenant story. The critique comes from within that story and uses Israel's prophets. The target is fruitless leadership, corrupted sacred authority, and reliance upon the institution as protection from judgment. Any reading that turns the fig tree into a license for contempt toward Jews reverses the moral direction of the passage. Jesus stands as Israel's Messiah, invoking Isaiah and Jeremiah against leaders in Jerusalem. The conflict continues immediately in Mark 12. Chief priests, scribes, and elders ask Jesus what authority permits his actions. Jesus answers with a question about John's baptism. They calculate the political cost of either reply and claim not to know. Jesus then tells the parable of the vineyard tenants. A man plants a vineyard, builds a wall, digs a winepress, erects a tower, leases it, and leaves. At the proper season, again Kairos, he sends a servant to receive fruit. The tenants beat the servant and send him away empty. Others are beaten or killed. Finally, the owner sends a beloved son, reasoning that they will respect him. The tenants kill the son and throw him out of the vineyard. The owner comes, destroys the tenants, and gives the vineyard to others. The leaders recognize that Jesus has told the parable against them. The fig tree and vineyard now interpret one another. Both involve an owner or authority seeking fruit. Both involve an appointed time. Both end in judgment when the expected fruit is absent or withheld. The vineyard imagery reaches directly to Isaiah 5, where Israel is God's carefully cultivated vineyard. God looks for justice, but finds bloodshed, for righteousness, but hears a cry. The prophetic wordplay is sharper in Hebrew than English can easily reproduce. Expected social fruit is replaced by violence. Mark's temple conflict belongs to that same covenant lawsuit. Jesus does not reject the biblical demand for fruit. He announces that the demand has reached its crisis in the rejection of the beloved Son. Psalm 118 also returns. The crowds used it during the entry. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. After the vineyard parable, Jesus quotes the same psalm's stone imagery. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Entry, temple, fig tree, vineyard, rejected stone. Mark has woven the scenes into one argument. The leaders responsible for building reject the stone God chooses. The tenants responsible for fruit reject the Son. The tree responsible for fruit displays leaves. The temple responsible for prayer among the nations has become a refuge from prophetic accountability. The consequences unfold in Mark 13. As Jesus leaves the temple, a disciple marvels at its stones and buildings. Jesus replies that not one stone will be left upon another. The disciples then sit with him across the Kidron Valley on the Mount of Olives and ask when these things will happen. Jesus warns about deceivers, conflict, persecution, and desolation. Interpreters debate how the discourse relates the destruction of Jerusalem, the suffering of the disciples, and the coming of the Son of Man. The historical destruction came under Rome in the year 70. Legions commanded by Titus besieged Jerusalem, and the temple burned. Mark's exact date of composition in relation to the war is debated, but many scholars place the gospel around that crisis. For hearers who knew the temple's fate, the tree withered from the roots would carry terrible historical weight. The sanctuary had looked immovable. Its stones appeared permanent. Its destruction was as unthinkable as a green tree dying overnight. Yet Mark does not end the temple theme with Roman fire. At Jesus' trial, witnesses accuse him of threatening to destroy the temple made with hands and build another not made with hands. Mark says their testimony does not agree, so the accusation cannot simply be treated as an exact quotation from Jesus. Still, the theme reaches the crucifixion. Passers-by mock Jesus with the temple charge. Chief priests mock his inability to save himself. Then Jesus dies, and the temple curtain is torn from top to bottom. The torn curtain has been interpreted in several ways. It may signify judgment upon the sanctuary. It may signify opened access to God. It may reveal divine grief. Mark does not pause to explain the symbol, and more than one resonance may be present. What is clear is that the temple's innermost boundary is affected at the moment Jesus dies. Then a Roman centurion confesses, "Truly, this man was God's son." The house intended as prayer for all nations has been judged. At the cross, a representative of the nations recognizes what the Jerusalem leaders reject. The irony completes the Isaiah quotation without reducing the scene to a slogan. The Gospel's movement is from the temple court to the crucified Son. This canonical development continues beyond Mark. Acts begins with disciples worshiping in Jerusalem and gathering around the temple. The earliest community does not immediately abandon the sacred site. Peter and John pray there. Apostolic preaching fills its courts. Conflict then intensifies. Stephen argues that the Most High does not dwell in houses made by human hands and recounts Israel's resistance to God's messengers. His speech leads to his death and the scattering of believers. Paul later describes communities themselves as God's temple because the Spirit dwells among them. Ephesians portrays Jews and Gentiles built together upon the apostolic and prophetic foundation, with Christ as cornerstone. 1 Peter speaks of believers as living stones built into a spiritual house. Hebrews develops another line. Jesus is high priest in a heavenly sanctuary, and his sacrifice is presented as decisive and unrepeatable. Access to God is grounded in his priestly work, rather than the continuing cycle of animal offerings. These writings do not all use Mark's fig tree image. They carry forward the same historical canonical transition. The Jerusalem temple remains central to Israel's story. Jesus announces judgment upon its leadership and order. His death and resurrection become the center of access, sacrifice, priesthood, and the gathering of the nations. If this investigation is helping clarify Mark's structure, subscribe and continue studying the biblical text with us. Thanks also to those whose support makes sustained historical and literary work possible. Now return to the roots. Mark could have said only that the leaves fell. He says the tree was withered from the roots. The phrase makes restoration of that particular tree impossible within the story. It will not recover next season. The prophetic sign concerns an order whose judgment is decisive. But Mark does not say God's covenant purposes have withered. Jesus speaks of faith in God. He creates a praying and forgiving community. The rejected stone becomes the cornerstone. The son is killed, yet he rises. The nations are gathered through the gospel. Judgment and new construction stand together. This prevents the tree from becoming a symbol of mere destruction. The old center is judged because the kingdom is being centered upon the Son. The temple's vocation toward the nations is not abandoned. It is carried forward through the gospel Jesus announces and the mission his followers undertake. Matthew tells the fig tree episode too, but his arrangement helps reveal what Mark is doing. In Matthew 21, Jesus enters Jerusalem, acts in the temple, heals the blind and lame there, answers the indignation of the chief priests and scribes, and returns to Bethany. The following morning, he curses the tree, and it withers immediately. The disciples marvel at how quickly it happened, and Jesus teaches about faith and prayer. Matthew keeps the temple and tree close together, but he compresses the miracle into a single scene. Mark stretches it across 2 mornings. That delay creates the opening into which the temple action is placed. The disciples hear the curse before entering Jerusalem, but they do not see its result until after leaving the temple. The reader must hold the unfinished tree story in memory while watching Jesus overturn tables and teach from Isaiah and Jeremiah. The difference is not a contradiction about whether the tree withered. Both Gospels present the same prophetic sign and connect it with faith. The difference is narrative emphasis. Matthew highlights the sudden effectiveness of Jesus' word. Mark highlights the relationship between the tree and the temple. This also explains why Mark reports that the disciples heard the curse. Jesus could have spoken privately or acted without words. Instead, his followers become witnesses before they understand. They hear judgment pronounced, walk with him through the temple confrontation, and discover the withering the next morning. Peter's reaction is not merely surprise that a miracle occurred. It is recognition that Jesus' word has taken effect. Throughout Mark, the authority of Jesus' speech is a central theme. In Capernaum, people are astonished because he teaches with authority rather than as the scribes. An unclean spirit obeys his rebuke. A fever leaves at his touch. A storm becomes calm when he speaks. Jairus' daughter rises when he addresses her. A deaf man's ears open. Blindness gives way to sight. Demons, disease, wind, sea, death, and bodily weakness all yield before him. Most of those signs restore. The fig tree is different. It is the only miracle in the Synoptic Gospels in which Jesus directly brings destructive judgment upon a living thing. That difference should make the reader slow down. Mark has not suddenly changed Jesus into a performer displaying power against nature. The unusual form of the miracle matches the unusual moment in the story. Jesus has reached Jerusalem. His conflict with the authorities is no longer distant. The temple has been inspected. The cross is days away. The miracle of destruction signals that the gospel has entered the hour of judgment. Even so, the object is a tree, not a person. As in the enacted signs of the prophets, a visible object bears the announcement so that hearers may grasp what is coming. The withering makes the verdict tangible without narrating immediate violence against the leaders who oppose Jesus. Their response unfolds through debate, conspiracy, arrest, trial, and the handing over of Jesus to Rome. The irony is severe. The one who pronounces judgment upon fruitlessness will soon be judged by fruitless leaders. The one who claims authority over the temple will be condemned in the name of protecting sacred order. The beloved son in the vineyard parable will be taken outside and killed. Yet the resurrection reverses the verdict placed upon him. The tree remains dead. The rejected son rises. That contrast separates the symbol from the Messiah. Jesus is not simply another victim swallowed by the collapse of Jerusalem's leadership. He is the cornerstone around whom God builds after the builders reject him. The location adds another layer. Bethany lies beyond the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem. Each morning, Jesus approaches the city from the east, and each evening, he withdraws. The route places the temple before him as he descends toward Jerusalem. Ezekiel had once seen the glory of the Lord depart from the temple and stand upon the mountain east of the city. Zechariah described a future day when the Lord would stand on the Mount of Olives and bring a great act of deliverance and judgment. Mark does not quote those passages directly in the fig tree scene, so their precise influence should not be overstated. Still, the geography belongs to a prophetic landscape. Jesus comes from the Mount of Olives. He enters as a king. He inspects the temple. He announces judgment. He later sits on that mountain to predict the sanctuary's destruction. The movements are theological as well as geographical. The disciples, however, remain fascinated by power. They marvel at the withering. Soon they will marvel at the temple's great stones. Earlier, they argued about greatness. Later, they will fail to remain awake in Gethsemane. Mark repeatedly shows them seeing the visible sign while struggling to understand the path of the suffering Son. That makes Jesus' answer about faith especially important. He does not tell them to admire his power. He directs them toward God. Faith in God, prayer, and forgiveness form the response of the disciple community as the temple order approaches judgment. The community will not possess Herod's platform, priestly courts, sacrificial animals, or political force. Its life will depend upon God's authority and the reconciling practice commanded by Jesus. The mountain saying belongs in that setting. In the prophets, mountains can be leveled before God's saving work. Isaiah speaks of mountains made low as a highway is prepared for the Lord. Zechariah addresses a great mountain that will become a plain before Zerubbabel as the temple is rebuilt. Jewish prayer could use mountain-moving language for what only divine power could accomplish. Jesus takes that language of impossibility and places it beside the Judge Temple Mount. Whether this mountain refers directly to the Temple Mount or functions as a general expression, the saying declares that the future of God's purpose does not depend on the apparent permanence of stone. The disciples will face what looks immovable: Jerusalem's authorities, Roman power, their teacher's death, the loss of the temple, the mission to the nations. Jesus answers with faith in God, not confidence in visible institutions. The forgiveness command then defines the character of their prayer. The leaders in Jeremiah's temple sermon used worship to conceal violence. Jesus will not allow his followers to turn prayer into another covering for broken covenant relationships. They must release the debts they hold while asking the Father to release theirs. Prayer without forgiveness would reproduce the same contradiction as leaves without fruit. This is why the passage cannot be divided into a miracle lesson first and a temple protest second. Its parts belong together. The tree displays the verdict. The temple reveals the cause. The teaching on faith describes the people who must live beyond the judgment. The following controversies expose the resistance of the leaders. The vineyard parable identifies the rejected son. The temple discourse announces the historical consequence. The passion reveals the new center. Mark 11 is a hinge. Before it, Jesus travels toward Jerusalem while repeatedly predicting his death. After it, Jerusalem's authorities move steadily toward killing him. At the hinge stands a fruitless tree. The word fruit itself gathers the themes. Fruit is what covenant privilege is meant to yield. Israel's scriptures associate it with justice, faithfulness, worship, peace, and the proper response to God. Fruit cannot be replaced by ancestry, architecture, sacrifice, learning, or public acclaim. Leaves may accompany fruit. They cannot substitute for it. The temple had genuine gifts. It preserved worship commanded in the Torah, carried memories of deliverance and restoration, and drew pilgrims who desired to honor the Lord. Jesus' critique has force precisely because the institution possessed a holy calling. The greater the calling, the more serious the absence of its proper fruit. Isaiah's nations were to find prayer. Jeremiah's oppressed were to find justice. God was to find covenant faithfulness. Jesus found a house whose leaders would soon plot the death of the Son. That is the fig tree's accusation. The detail most readers overlook is therefore not a hidden fact about unripe figs. It is Mark's placement. Jesus curses the tree. Jesus confronts the temple. The tree withers. Read the temple without the tree, and the action can look like a temporary reform. Read the tree without the temple, and the curse can look arbitrary. Read them together, and they become one prophetic declaration. God has come seeking fruit. The institution has leaves. The appointed time has arrived. The final days in Jerusalem then move with relentless logic. The leaders question Jesus' authority. The tenants reject the beloved Son. The builders reject the cornerstone. Jesus predicts the temple's fall. False testimony invokes the temple at his trial. Mockers repeat it at the cross. The curtain tears when he dies. Mark's fig tree stands at the entrance to that sequence. Its leaves belong to Passover week, when Jerusalem appears most religiously alive. Pilgrims fill the city. Sacrifices multiply. Priests serve. Psalms are sung. The temple dominates the skyline. And Jesus finds no fruit. If you want more investigations that follow these literary and historical connections through Scripture, subscribe or follow. Share this video with 5 people, comment with the Mark 11 detail that stood out, and suggest another biblical passage for a future study. The last image is the one Peter saw in the morning, not an angry traveler beside an unlucky tree, a prophet on the road from Bethany. Behind him, the temple rises in full view. Before him, a tree covered yesterday with leaves has withered from